Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Warm greetings. I am Johanna Chao Kreilick, the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it is truly a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this UCS conversation tonight, Writing for Impact, How Narrative Inspires Change. It is fantastic to have the many hundreds of you around our virtual table, including some longtime members who've been invested with us for decades, others who are joining through your connection to one of our wonderful speakers, and some of you from the wider public who are just plain interested in this, what is to be a fascinating conversation. I and everyone in the UCS family are so pleased that you are here with us tonight. And for those of you newer to UCS, the Union of Concerned Scientists, I wanted to let you know that we are the country's, and I would say the world's leading science-centered advocacy organization. We put rigorous independent science into action at the intersection of science, policy, and law to advance progress on the three biggest interlocking threats of our times: climate change, democracy, and nuclear security. Now, UCS conversations like this one tonight are a pretty special part of our programming because through them, we get to engage with some supremely talented folks from across a wide range of disciplines whose work connects to our core values and issues. Recent UCS conversations have featured the insights and examples of artists, journalists, faith leaders, and others who are all working to advance aims that we all share. And tonight, we are going to hear from three exceptional writers who are taking up the issue of climate change and the environment in their work. Ours is a pretty timely conversation. Following on the heels of a major global event for climate and the environment, the recent United Nations Climate Conference in Egypt, known as COP27. I had the privilege to be on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we realized some pretty concrete progress and action on a fight that climate advocates have been waging for over 30 years, loss and damage. And that progress came in the form of both a recognition that the countries and territories who've contributed the least to global emissions are bearing the heaviest burden of climate-mounting climate catastrophes. The progress there also took shape in the creation of a global fund for climate-vulnerable countries and territories to adapt to and address the steadily intensifying climate impacts. We didn't get everything that we wanted, and there is so much more to do. But I left Egypt and COP27 inspired what is made possible by the persistence and fortitude and courage, and really steeped in the knowledge that it's up to each and every single one of us to make the future that we want to see. Science and our everyday experience tell us definitively that humanity retains an enormous amount of control over just how hot it's going to get on our precious planet. And what we know for sure is that the world of the future is going to reflect the decisions that we make today. So the upshot here is that absolutely everyone on this call, whether you are a writer, a scientist, in business, a student, parent, grandparent, you are each needed, and you each can and are needed to make a difference. And so while we're focusing tonight on the unique contributions that writers make to our common movement, we are ultimately a gathering of like-minded folks this evening, and we are reaching for a depth of common understanding and solidarity that truly is bigger than ourselves. So it's with this spirit of possibility and solidarity in mind that I am so pleased to turn to tonight's program. Our UCS conversation tonight is among authors who have written in three distinct genres about climate change and about humanity's relationship to the environment. Our writers tonight each invite us to different views on our role as settlers, as colonizers, as stewards, and as caretakers. And through their craft, each of these three take on the complexity and enormity of the challenges before us and create stories that help us observe and understand and see ourselves as part of the solution. One of my favorite writers, the author Audre Lorde, once said, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. In the forefront of our move towards change, there is only our poetry to hint at possibilities made real." And what I think she's saying here is that we don't know how to make a better world until we can imagine a better world. Now, this isn't to diminish the importance of science or policy or law, all of which are crucially important tools for creating a livable future, but story and the narrative that empowers us to dream, to put language and vision to our dreams, and to bring people along is crucial. If climate change is indeed the fight of our lives, we will not win this fight just by the facts. We need stories. And this movement needs each and every one of us. So whether you are researching, advocating, litigating, teaching, or writing, do it as if everything you love is on the line, because it is. So on with our conversation, and to take us forward, I have the great pleasure to introduce my wonderful colleague, Lisa Nurnberger. Lisa is our media director at UCS, where she manages our press team, helping to ensure that UCS analysis experts' messages are visible in media coverage around the country and indeed around the world, and helping our work reach key audiences where we can have the most impact. Lisa herself is an incredibly skilled communicator, a translator of science for public understanding, and she has worked many years, decades, as a reporter for public radio and has received numerous awards for her reporting. We're super lucky to have Lisa moderating tonight, since her experience reaching audiences with story and science is going to be particularly insightful as she leads this conversation. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for that context and introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Nurnberger. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure you'll find the work and the perspectives of this panel fascinating and inspiring. As a science-based organization, as Johanna said, UCS conducts research and analyses to quantify the harm being caused by pressing problems. When we can, we also identify specifically who is being harmed, sometimes even drilling down by zip code. Our studies also identify solutions. We then share our findings with the public and decision makers to try to affect change. But what I knew as a reporter, and know now as the media director at UCS, is that to truly get people's attention, we need to share more than just raw data. We need to share the stories of and from the people who are being harmed. Stories are what resonate with people. They're as old as humankind. They date back to cave drawings and oral tradition passed down through the generations. A good story penetrates our hearts. It can make us laugh, cry, and compel action. A story actually in the Philadelphia Inquirer about a drunken oil tanker captain hitting a reef and spilling so much oil that it coated and killed or trapped thousands of birds and sea otters is what compelled me, as a recent journalism grad, to pack up for Valdez, Alaska, to work for free at the Volunteer Response Center. And I was far from the only one. But it's not just news stories that educate people about the Earth and how its inhabitants are being harmed. It's nonfiction, fiction, sci-fi and fantasy even, and plays. They all reach different people, almost tapping different parts of our brains, and certainly our psyches, allowing us to feel emotions, see the world in new ways, and open up to new ideas. That's what I'm looking forward to delving into tonight. We have a stellar lineup of writers, each who occupy different genres, cultural lenses, and expertise. Through their work writing fiction, nonfiction, and plays, they weave narratives that connect to their audiences and broaden understanding and resonance for issues that can, for many, feel overwhelming and overly complex. We're going to divide this program into two sections. First, I'll introduce each of our speakers in sequence. We'll have a short one-on-one conversation, and we'll share a bit more about their work with you. Once we meet each of our three panelists, we'll come back together as a group for more expansive conversation about how their work explores our impact on the planet and serves to inform, move, and inspire action. I want to note that we will not be taking questions, but encourage you to engage and interact in the chat. Please be mindful and respectful of this shared space. Anyone engaging in abusive behavior will be removed from the call. So now let me turn to our writers. Chantal Bilodeau is a Montreal-born, New York-based playwright whose work focuses on the intersection of storytelling and climate change. She is the founder of the Arts and Climate Initiative, and in her capacity as artistic director, has spearheaded local and global initiatives for over a decade. She's been instrumental in getting the theater and educational communities, as well as audiences in the US and abroad, to engage in climate action through a variety of programming, including a worldwide distributed theater festival that coincides with the United Nations COP meetings. As a playwright, Chantal is working on a series of 8 plays that looks at the social and environmental changes taking place in the 8 Arctic states. In 2019, she was named one of the 8 trailblazers who are changing the climate conversation by the Audubon magazine. Chantal, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Lisa. It's nice to be here.
To start, tell us how you began seeing the opportunity to connect your work as a playwright with your passion for climate change.
It was a trip to Alaska that got me started. I guess it's similar to your story. I knew somebody who lived in Alaska and was a bush pilot in Denali National Park, and I was invited to visit. This was in 2007, I believe, and the combination of climate change being more present in the mainstream conversation and me getting to have a very visceral experience of it when you think about glaciers retreating, deflating, being able to see the lines on the mountains, and hearing conversations from people about migration patterns changing, species moving north, berries not being harvested at the same time. It had a very vivid impression on me. And I wanted to try to give this very visceral sense to people who might never get there. And also at the time, we had a much less vivid understanding on how we, in the lower 48, as the people in Alaska call us, how we impact the Arctic and how the Arctic impacts what's going on here. And I was also trying to make a link between those two places.
And you've played a really important role in elevating climate narratives in theater. What have you learned or observed from other playwrights with whom you've worked about the opportunities and the challenges of centering climate change in your plays?
There are a lot of challenges and few opportunities, although that is starting to change. Where for a long time, the theater, both on the artistic side and on the audience side, we're not too interested in engaging with that subject matter. I feel like it has changed, especially since the pandemic. So in the last 2-3 years, it's starting to change. And I think one thing that's still, I'll be curious to hear from the other panelists, but something that's still hard to overcome in the theater world is artists being a little stuck in imagining the apocalypse. It's like we can't move beyond that. There's still this sense of weight is so strong that artists have a hard time breaking out from that and imagining something a little bit more positive.
Thank you so much, Chantal. We will get back to more about your work, and you're already sparking questions in my mind that I want to circle back to you about. Let's now turn to Jessica Hernandez. Dr. Jessica Hernandez is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to environmental physics. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. She is the author of Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, and is currently working on her second book, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots of Climate Displacement and Justice. Jessica has been named by Forbes as one of the 100 most powerful and influential women of Central America. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us.
Buendio Paducci, thank you for having me here today. Today, I'm virtually calling from the shared waters and lands of the Coast people and the Duwamish people. Thank you again for joining.
I wanted to ask you, your writing challenges writers to see the world through an entirely different lens. Most people in the US, I imagine, probably approach the world, its problems and solutions from a Western perspective. But Fresh Banana Leaves calls on the reader to see the world through a different set of eyes, through Zapotec or Mayan eyes, turning a lot of people's almost, I don't know if long-held beliefs is the word, but I'll use it for lack of a better word, really the foundation of our current day Western civilization on its head. Why is it so important for people to see this different way of being in the world?
For me, I think that it's important to highlight the ways that as Indigenous peoples, we view our roles, especially our local environments, just because when we talk about climate change, oftentimes at the table where the decision making is happening, especially with climate policy, climate mitigation, adaptation strategies, Indigenous peoples are not invited. Yet we face most of the responsibility, the inequities that come as a result of climate change. Being a part of nature, especially given our creation stories and how it has been embodied in our storytelling that we are a part of nature because our gods and goddesses and deities kind of created us from those natural elements of our local environments. You know, we have this strong relationship with our environments, and as a result, when we are seeing how climate change is impacting our local environments, we carry that responsibility to heal not just ourselves but also our plant, animal, and non-living relatives.
And as you point out in your book that Indigenous science or knowledge is based on information collected from observation, really over thousands of years since time immemorial. That's a phrase that I've also heard a lot from tribal leaders throughout Alaska. Can you talk a bit about where does Western concepts of science overlap and diverge from Indigenous science?
I think in some of the ways where we overlap is like, observations, right? We're always trying to understand our world, especially better understand our world as it's constantly changing, whether it be environmental impacts or climate change impacts. One of the things where it differs is that oftentimes in science and Western science, we're told to remove ourselves, especially in the name of objectivity, where science tries to be objective. Yet for Indigenous peoples, many of our spirituality, all of our relations that we have with our plants, animal, and non-living relatives is at the core center of the science that we practice. So sometimes in Western science, Indigenous knowledges or science is kind of dismissed because, it's more subjective as opposed to objective.
Thank you so much. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Let me now turn to Kim Stanley Robinson. Kim Stanley Robinson is an American science fiction writer. He's the author of more than 20 books, including The Ministry for the Future, one of President Obama's favorite books in 2020. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine. He works for the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, the Clarion Writers Workshop, and UC San Diego's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. In 2016, he was given the Heinlein Award for Lifetime Achievement in Science Fiction, and in 2017, he was given the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination in Service to Society. Stan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's good to be with you.
Great to have you here. Your books not only tell compelling stories, but are really incredibly researched. Do you write with the intention of educating readers and inspiring action, even planting specific policy ideas sometimes for decision makers? Or are your stories more ideas that bubble up that almost take on a life of their own? And I'm kind of thinking specifically of the Ministry for the Future here, but I'm sure that pertains to many of your books.
Yeah, well, it's there are always multiple motives for writing a novel, and as a science fiction writer, I've always set my stories in the future. So if we're trying to imagine change, then science fiction is explicitly about that by setting stories in the future. And my entire career, it's seemed important to me to try to portray positive futures, to resist this apocalyptic notion that Chantal mentioned, and imagine for everybody that we can make a better world. So sometimes it's called utopian fiction, but at our moment in history, I think it's better to talk about best case scenarios and dodging the mass extinction event. So once you have that desire to write that kind of a story, then the research is partly done to make the story seem solider to the reader, so that the reader reading it will not be kicked out by a sense that, well, it would never really happen this way. So it's possible that I maybe overbulk my stories with research and facts to give a sense of solidity to the parts of it that are entirely speculative and made up with the intent to show we can make a better world. So it's a reiterative process. I write scenes, then I research in order to make the scene seem stronger. And I do want to put out their solutions, and partly because we need to think about them, partly because they're new stories to tell. And you know, a lot of stories have been told in human history. It's what we do, one of the main things we do. So when you have a new story, it's kind of precious just for its newness. And since we're in an unprecedented situation now, the newness is even disorienting. So I go to these stories for multiple reasons, and they all seem to coalesce in Ministry for the Future.
And was it your passion for the value of science that informed your writing early on, or did science fiction, which is often a projection of today's realities, develop that interest for you?
I think it was that I loved science fiction when I ran into it as an undergraduate, because it seemed to express the way life had felt to me up to that point, growing up in Southern California and everything changing faster than you could comprehend. And so really the literature came first, and in order to write better science fiction, I had to know more about the sciences. I'm an English major, but I also married a scientist. My wife is an environmental chemist for U.S. Geological Survey, and she's the member of UCS in the family. And so that's given me a lifetime of watching scientists at work, listening to them on conference calls and over Zooms, and giving me an immense admiration for the project of the science fiction, the science community itself, that the way that science is a method to try to come to agreements on what's out there, what's real, what we can do about it. I've become an advocate or a fan, and so that's made it also the right genre for me.
Nice that you have an in-house fact checker.
Indeed. I have to say, she's the kind of scientist that if I ask her about anything except for the fate of pesticides in water, she'll just say, well, how should I know? I'm not an expert in that.
That sounds like our experts. Let's bring everybody back together now for a conversation with all of our panelists. Great. I'd like to start the conversation by pulling a quote from the introduction in Jessica's book. I thought this was really great. One book cannot change our environmental discourse, but if seeds can be planted here and there, those seeds will sprout and create a ripple effect that can lead to change. Can each of you speak to how you see your work as planting those seeds and the impact that you've seen? Chantal, would you like to start?
Yeah, I like to, a lot of time I'm going to answer a little bit with another question. A lot of time people ask me how I see the difference between art and activism. And I always say that activism is the closest way to get from A to B, but it's less deep. And the arts create really deep change, but it's much smaller, much longer. It takes much longer. And I think we plant seeds, it's very rare that any one piece of art will have like this massive impact, but every piece of art has a little impact that builds on the other one. So, and I think it contributes to changing the landscape or the culture. So things that seem really new become natural, just like, 40 years ago, recycling with this big new thing, and like, what, I'm gonna keep my garbage and do something else with it. And I remember teaching my parents about it because I was learning it in school. And so in today's world, if we get used to hearing stories where somebody has a job installing solar panels instead of working in a mine, or it becomes natural to compost. Like all of these little things, eventually they're like, oh yeah, that's just part of our normal life. And I think art has a big role in making that more common.
That's interesting. Even with news stories, I've seen that just the way in which people view the world. For instance, the word resilience was not really a common word up until we were talking about more in terms of climate change. And now the word is ubiquitous and we see it all the time in news stories. Jessica, what do you think? Can you speak a bit about the seeds that you've planted?
Yeah, when I think about seeds, especially the changes and the indigenous presence, right? We're finally seeing how indigenous knowledge or science is finally being acknowledged, especially in international and national entities. For instance, in the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in their report this year, they finally acknowledge indigenous knowledges are holding some strength or some solutions, especially to mitigate climate change impacts. We are also seeing how this current administration is finally acknowledging indigenous knowledges as something that it's important to integrate, especially in managing our natural resources and our environments. And one of the seeds that my generation of indigenous scientists is planting is those acknowledgement seeds, where we're finally being acknowledged, but now we will like those seeds to sprout into changes, right, into actions where indigenous peoples can have the resources, the accommodations, everything that they need in order for us to truly address climate change, especially as climate change, while it may be inconvenient for non-Indigenous communities, for our Indigenous communities, it has become deadly, where it's forcefully displacing many of our people from the global south to the global north, because we have Indigenous peoples across the globe. And I think that that's the fight that my generation has, and we're looking forward to seeing how we can plant those seeds of acknowledgement and see them grow into flowers of changes, right, in actions that are enabling Indigenous peoples to reach justice. Thank you for that question.
I like that imagery. Stan, what of the seeds you've planted and the impact that they've had?
Well, I write as an American leftist, for the public over the private, for government over business, for people over profit, a consistent political program. So we live in the world of what you might call capitalist realism. And it might just be fashionable cynicism or a fear of hoping too much and being disappointed, a feeling of being stuck and that nothing can exist but what exists now. And yet what exists now is unsustainable and headed for a crash. So then you get climate dread and feelings of despair. And here I want to follow up on what Jessica was saying about indigeneity. You have an older worldview that is more connected to the planet. And there's so much that indigenous peoples can teach us in modern civilization because we're so cut off from our roots. But the main lesson, for me at least, has been a sense of the planet as our parent, as our extended body, as our horizontal brothers and sisters, and also the thing that's the organism that's keeping us alive. And this isn't kind of instrumental rationality or capitalist realism. It is solidarity with other people and other creatures that will help us to survive. So, okay, as a science fiction writer, I can just tell that story as if it's already happened. And it's a hell of a seed, because in the mind of the reader co-creates these things. They look at sentences on a page, and then in their mind, they have to pull that together into a vision. So there's a certain ancient power of prophecy that comes to trying to write stories set in the future that not predict things, but call for things. And you get a change in the general structure of feeling. You seldom can see these results in the world. Publishing a book is like dropping a rock into a pond. I very much envy Chantal's art form, because you're in a room with other people and there's an electricity to theater. I mean, I'm a theater goer and I love it. And that shared sense of electricity in the air of something that'll happen only once and never again, well, that's magical. For me, with novels, I have to trust my readers and then just hope for the best.
A lot of the points you made lead well into the next question. which is you've each written about who is harmed the most by climate change and environmental degradation. Jessica, you share a deeply personal history of colonization and oppression that has led to displacement, hardship, and environmental grief. Stan, the deadly heat wave in a struggling area of India is one of the main plot lines in the Ministry for the Future, really the catalyst for the rest of the book. And Chantal, you bring alive the voices and experiences of Indigenous tribes in the Arctic. What do you think we need to learn and understand about how colonization, capitalism, and consumption lead to harm and disproportionate impacts? And I know this is a big question that we could talk for weeks about, really, but what's needed to address and remedy that? Who would like to start? Jessica, I see you nodding your head.
I was thinking, but I think oftentimes, right, one of the things that, being an Indigenous scientist, I have to acknowledge that I have a privilege to have a PhD, to hold those master's degrees that have validated the knowledges that my people have had for, thousands of years since time immemorial. And I think that for me, it's always acknowledging the reality that we're still even upholding these systems where, I need a PhD in order for me to be the only Indigenous person invited into certain spaces. And how do I call that out, right? Because I think that oftentimes when we look at my community members, my elders are our PhD holders. They're the ones that hold the most knowledge more than I do, because I'm still young, I'm still growing, I'm still becoming, working towards becoming an elder. And I think that oftentimes we have to acknowledge even how we individually are, holding up these positions, these frameworks that are oppressing Indigenous peoples, that are oppressing the Black community. And oftentimes one of the things that I often tell scientists is to look at the history behind the science that we practice. Oftentimes we think that the science we're practicing is subjective, but when we actually dive into the history of many of these scientific concepts, they're rooted on racism, they're rooted on capitalism, they're rooted on colonialism. But yet we're kind of holding that blind eye towards it so that we can have this pure science that is objective, that's free from all of these frameworks, where in reality, many of the science concepts are deeply rooted in that. And as scientists, we need to acknowledge that if we really want to start dismantling those layers of capitalism, colonialism, and oppression that are still targeting and oppressing Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color, especially in the global South, we have to acknowledge our role in the global North and how that's even oppressing people in the global South. And I think that that's the starting point, right? Like, how do we self-reflect, educate ourselves so that we are not unconsciously, not directly, indirectly holding these systems that we're always calling out, yet we don't necessarily reflect on the actions that we are taking every day.
And Stan, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the same novel, but it was Obama's favorite book. So
It's okay.
in that novel, and it addresses climate change, so clearly straight on, you really, the current system that we have, the current economic system, simply doesn't work in terms of addressing climate. I mean, it was a huge topic that you took on.
Yes. Well, we live in a global capitalist system and a system of nation states. Both these systems are very poorly designed to deal with climate change. And indeed, they are part of the cause of climate change itself, in that we don't value, and I mean that not just morally and emotionally, but also financially, we don't properly value what you could call ecosystem services, which is to say the parts of your body that are outside your skin that keep you alive. It's money, capital, which is giant collections of money that are free to be invested, gets invested at the quote highest rate of return. So that highest rate of return is a factoid. It's made up. It's pseudoscience in that it actually takes quantities of costs and benefits and extracts a profit, which often a profit is just a measure of how much injustice and damage has been inflicted on the system and pulled out for the 1%. So we have capitalism, we have racism, we have sexism as part of a power dynamic where a few control the lives of the many, and it's wrecking things. All right, that you can describe, of course, is a very quick description in the largest generalities. How do you solve that? One aspect of it would be to have a different measuring system where you had true cost benefits, where you took risk-adjusted investment, which risk-adjusted means paying attention to the planet and to the climate, and recalculating what we do. That is a legal matter, so that laws would be necessary. There are laws now that create markets, that create profits, that create corporate structures, and that create the current power dynamic. Those laws could be changed if we made democracy real and made our legislators legislate for the people and the planet. So in my novel that comes down to long chapters, this is very crazy and wonky about things like tax structures. There should be sharply progressive taxation. The bigger the corporation, the more it gets taxed. It should be taxes on individuals as well as corporations. It should be tax on income and assets. This is a redistributive. It's fairly conservative in this sense. It's been done before. It's a system that has worked. Sometimes it's called Keynesianism as opposed to neoliberalism. So it's not the total solution. None of these things are going to be total solutions. But for sure, I wanted to write about paying people to do good green work rather than paying people for exploitation and damage. So it became a plot point in my novel, and I think that's one of the reasons that you are coming back to Ministry for the Future again and again. There are few novels that do that talk about our system of accounting in effect. And believe me, it felt a little crazy while I did it, but I can tell that it fulfilled a hunger.
I can imagine it was dense. There were a lot of concepts in there.
Yes.
And Chantal, you certainly in your very first play, you address this consumerism. There's the family who wants to leave their apartment for bigger, better. That's always driving us. The feeling of I must conquer nature, I must conquer the ice. And what strikes me with your medium, I wonder is it easier because it's such a hard topic to get people to want to pay attention to because it's so depressing, quite frankly. I'm talking about climate change. Is your medium as a playwright, is it easier to kind of bring people in almost unbeknownst to them and introduce these topics in a way that's more literary and maybe easier for them to digest rather than, for instance, through news articles that just hits them over the head again and again with the facts?
Yeah, I mean, you can make arguments for and against. I don't know if it's easier because, most of the time, if people walk into a theater, they're trapped there for the length of the play. It's a little, unless they want to step over everybody on their way out, they kind of have to live with it for the whole time. On the other hand, you're bringing a group of people together who belongs to a certain community. So there is something about that. There's something about experiencing something as a group, as opposed to as an individual. And a group, for the most part, especially if the playwright is local, it is about this community. And you can, one of the things I've often heard from audience members when they come to either one of my plays or plays that I helped put up is, oh, I didn't know there were that many people who shared those values around me. Because people feel very alone. They feel very, it's hard. They feel wiped out. They don't know where to find the energy to keep going when they have the impression that nobody else cares. But there is this benefit of bringing people together when they see a play. And also they get to experience bodies on stage. So it's a very live experience. As Stan mentioned before, it's something that can't be repeated. You're there once and nobody's ever going to have that same experience. So that's one thing that the theater can do well.
And you certainly do well through your plays. And
thank you.
When you mentioned the feeling that people are feeling in viewing or reading this, I'm wondering about just what drives each of you to write. Is it passion, or is it a sense of despondency that drives your desire to tell the story? or maybe a combination? Dan?
Well, I've always loved to read, but I've also, since I was 15, always loved to go to the theater. My high school English teacher invited me to join the senior class trip when I was a freshman to go see the Royal Shakespeare Company visiting Los Angeles to put on The Taming of the Shrew. And it blew my mind. And there were no theaters in Orange County, California, when I was young. I had to go up to LA. I think it's a love of literature and of art, the literary arts, poetry for sure, the novel, and also theater. I've seen Thornton Wilder play The Skin of Our Teeth. It's about climate change, a human family going through the millennia in a symbolical way, quite beautiful. And another one, the Thanksgiving play, where people are learning how Thanksgiving originated and what it has to do with the indigenous people. Quite hilarious takedown of a concept of Thanksgiving. So it's love of art. And also, I want to put it this way. You can understand the world through a system of meaning. It could be a religion. It could be the psychological sciences. Science itself is obviously a system of meanings and a very powerful one. And for me, it's literature where, if you were thinking of it as a science, it would be case study after case study after case study, and you don't draw conclusions except in the most general sense of having read hundreds of novels, after seeing scores of plays. Your values are a composite of all the stories that you've seen put into a thing. So that, I would say, that's what drives me. I'm happy to be part of that process. It's a joy.
Jessica?
Yes, for me, it's more of a sense of healing, just because, the topics that I write about are things that I have personally lived through or that my family has lived through. For instance, the Central American Civil War that has been coined as a genocide against indigenous peoples is not something that is in the past for me. It can be actually traced to my father, who had to, experience this at the age of 11, who was able to escape and survive that at the age of 14. And I think that it's a sense of healing, especially as somebody who has been trained in the sciences, where the only option of writing that we have is peer review publications, where you have to write in a certain format. And I think being able to write this book that also kind of embodied my lived experiences, and center the lived experiences of my father, especially as someone who escaped a genocide. Even though as indigenous peoples, right, we're often told that genocide is a thing of the past. For me, it's not. It's something that we're still living the impacts of it today. And I think that for that, in that regards, is more of a sense of healing, especially as, I want to heal for the 7 generations. There's a lot of healing that we have to do, because, a genocide is not something that you can just bring in humor or other, positive emotions to be able to heal. You have to do that hard process, right? That hard journey that is very terrifying. It's a lot of, tears and things like that. So for me, writing my first book was a sense of healing, because I was able to remove myself from what we're told to write as scientists and actually bring in my lived experiences and perspectives, especially as they're interweave with the sciences that I practice.
Chantal, is your writing a form of healing as well, or are you writing from a place of passion, despondency at times? Is it a mixture?
So I started writing before I started writing about climate change. There was the process before I got to climate change, and I think it was a passion for the world and for the things I was afraid would disappear, the people I was afraid would suffer. And it was a desire to want to do my part to help with the gifts that I have. It's always funny, Stan, you mentioned envying my art form. I always envy other people. I always think other people have more impact. But I was like, okay, I'm a playwright, I can only reach so many people, but at least those people I can help share my view of the world and hope that it influences their view of the world too. It was important for me. And also I wanted to be able to live with myself later, you know, and think, well, I tried. I tried to do my part.
And you spoke earlier about writing for solutions, writing about solutions, and clearly all of you do that. It's a little bit different. It makes me think about news writing. We're hearing more and more reporters that they're tired of writing just the impact story that everybody knows about, you know, the flooding that's going to happen, and we're seeing the wildfires. We want to talk about solutions, and that's something that we're constantly pushing to reporters to talk about solutions, which sometimes people can think may be a little bit boring because the climate impacts are what people see and feel every day. How do you address that, just in terms of sharing those solutions and actually almost being an activist and suggesting solutions and planting them as seeds that then take hold and people see as realistic and not pie in the sky ideas? Stan, you want to take that one?
Sure. It seems to me that, well, we have an image in this culture that I think might be wrong, a false dichotomy between art as entertainment and art as education, as if entertainment will always be content-free and just for fun, and education will always be serious and eating your vegetables. And it just isn't true. Aristotle is very good on this. Bertolt Brecht is very good on this, going back to theater. Education can be hilariously entertaining, and entertainment can teach you a lot. So the trick for an artist would be, especially if you have a program that you want to push, a message you want to get out there, which hopefully you do, because otherwise what's your art for? Then you have to try to make both happen at once. So there, the sciences are very helpful. What's new? What's interesting because we didn't know it before? What can we say that if anybody on Earth were to look at the evidence, they would have to agree with you? Well, that's quite a challenging situation, and yet science is trying to do that all the time. So I think once you get a proper sense of what you're up to as an artist, you stop worrying about a false notion of art for art's sake, or a difference between education and entertainment. The two go together, and many people, of course, will remember their favorite professor or the head of their lab who was both hilarious and educational at the same time. It happens a lot, and it's the best. It's practice. It's something you have to work towards.
And Jessica, Fresh Banana Leaves really is almost a solutions novel in a way, would you say?
Yeah, because I think one of my main messages, especially, as an Indigenous scientist, is that our solutions are in our actions. And oftentimes we always think that, one person cannot make a big difference, but we can make a difference. And I think that oftentimes when we even talk about Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples having the solutions, we try to treat them as a monolithic group, when in reality Indigenous peoples, like you will probably know, right, Native Alaskans are way different than Southwest tribes. And I think that oftentimes when we look at the solutions, we had to look at our local Indigenous communities, because they know their environments mostly better than most of us, right, who have settled, who have been displaced to these local environments. And oftentimes when we look at solutions, especially when we're trying to integrate Indigenous peoples, we have to kind of do a lot of unlearning and relearning, especially as we're looking at the sciences, where the sciences teaches us that Indigenous peoples do not have the scientific knowledge. So for many of us, it's unlearning and relearning the ways that we have been taught that science should be formulated, that science is the only thing that has solutions, because in reality, right, indigenous communities, especially the local indigenous communities of those environments, are the ones that have the solutions. And I think that that's a way of how we can use our actions as our solutions, because many of us have to unlearn and relearn those histories that have been sugar coated for us, because it kind of makes us naive to the realities of these frameworks and systems that we're still upholding even today as individuals.
I love that phrase, unlearning and relearning, because I feel like that's a theme throughout all of your books and plays. Chantal, tell me about the way that you have approached that, sort of the unlearning and relearning and integrating solutions into your work. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I do a lot of research for my work. So I always talk about my work as being fact-based fiction, which is more common, I guess, in fiction than in plays. But I was trying to think, I don't know that I present solutions myself, but what I try to do is to empower people to find their own solution, empower them to believe that they have the capacity to make a difference, give them a sense that their contribution is needed, that they have something to offer that is of value. And I just taught a semester to young people this fall, and it was at the beginning of the class I asked, because I've heard it before, do some of you feel like you have no future? And a lot of hands went up, and that's just heartbreaking. And of course, it was a creative writing class. And of course, the best I could do was to teach them how to creatively engage with the climate, and how to maybe look at some avenues that they can pursue where they can then find their own ways to make a difference. And sometimes it can be very tangible, sometimes it can be creative, sometimes it's a shift of mind. Sometimes it ends up being, one person convincing their family that something should be different. It all looks different for each person. And I would be a little, because I'm not a scientist and I don't have those, I can't convince somebody that solution is better than another, but I can all say that we need to work towards something's better. And what is that thing for you?
You can point them to UCS's website.
Yeah.
The theme of working with nature versus against nature has shown up in all of your works, as well as the intrinsic value of nature, and you've all touched on that already. Let's talk a bit more about that. Chantal, I have definitely seen that theme in your writing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it comes from a lot from learning from Indigenous people. In my research, I have encountered a lot of Indigenous people. I have read some of their stories, heard some of their stories, and I naturally have a big love of nature, which I got from my father. So I think it wasn't a big stretch for me to embrace that idea that we need to be in agreement with nature. We need to listen to it, to respect it, as opposed to I have a play that I wrote that has a polar explorer in it. And Fridtjof Nansen, he was from Norway, and he was the first explorer to say, I'm going to go with the force of nature, thinking he was going to let the current at the North Pole get him to the pole, as opposed to like try to fight it. And I think that was a big shift. But in a lot of, certainly the big corporations today, and in a lot of cases, we still have this conquering mentality, because it's ingrained in us, and we don't necessarily see it, and so sometimes we don't even question it. So I think it's a good topic as a way to start reevaluating our assumptions and our worldviews, to just look at the relationship we have with nature.
And Jessica, the Fresh Banana Leaves is entirely about that, the sort of the way in which Western society really thinks about conquering nature. It's here for us. It was put here for us to use for our needs. Tell me more about that. Do you feel like the mindset of people writ large is somewhat shifting to understand that there's a different way?
I think there are many movements in environmentalism that are trying to like teach people how to unlearn and relearn the concept that, you know, nature is here to serve us. And oftentimes, even in my communities, right, we know that we are a part of nature, nature is a part of us. We know that nature protects us as long as we protect nature. For instance, in Oaxaca, right, we live in many mountains. So when we have heavy rainfalls, the trees will protect us from landslides, from mudslides, just because, you know, they're able to absorb many water. But because of deforestation, going back to capitalism and how capitalism teaches us to take everything that we can as opposed to everything that we need, many of our forests have been destroyed, right? So when we have heavy rainfalls that we're experiencing more often because of climate change, we're seeing how landslides and mudslides are, you know, destroying our homes and entire pueblos. And I think that oftentimes when we look at nature, we're still and we have to call out patriarchy, right? Because nature is given this feminine role, and as a result of being Mother Earth and Mother Nature, men think that, you know, they can own nature. Nature is supposed to be the nurturer for them, when in reality we need to have reciprocal relationships with our environments, whether we call it Mother Earth, Mother Nature, our, you know, our grandmother, and things like that. And I think that patriarchy is one of the components that have taught us as human, you know, and men, that, you know, because she is given that female role, that she's supposed to provide for us, but we're not supposed to do anything in return to support her, to help her heal, especially as we are drastically increasing, you know, greenhouse um, gas emissions that are, you know, increasing global warming, and as a result, kind of taking off the greenhouse effect from equilibrium, or, you know, taking our earth from equilibrium, where we're seeing these drastic weather changes.
And Stan, in Ministry for the Future, again, I love the end where you talked about these, it was more than wildlife corridors. Was it called the Half Earth program, I think, where plots were set aside specifically just recognizing the intrinsic value of nature and species. And
Yes, I mean, this is a movement in the real world that I find very encouraging. Half Earth was a book by E.O. Wilson, the great scientist and biologist who just recently died. And when I read it, which is maybe 15 years ago, I thought, well, that's a great idea, but will never happen. But at the COP15 for biodiversity that is either still going on in Montreal or else it's just finished, there is a program, a project to try to do 30 by 30% of the Earth's surface protected for wild creatures by the year 2030. And almost everybody involved with that program says to me that after 30 by 30, we'll get to 50 by 50. Now, it has to be clarified that this is not an anti-human position, that indeed the whole split between humans and nature is another one of these semi-false distinctions. We are nature, nature is us, and we rely on that extension of our bodies that is the larger biosphere and all the other creatures, but that we will be healthier if we don't cause a mass extinction event. This is just the flat case. And one way not to is to make room for the other creatures to live their lives without the harm of human beings. Now, there is indigenous caretaking to guide us in an interactional process that is the right attitude towards this relationship. It's not that we clear out and leave these lands completely empty. There will be human beings, there will be indigenous people who have always been there, and humans could stay in these lands as caretakers, but those lands would have special protections not to be wrecked for short-term profit. So, and also we are very close to a mass extinction event. There are so many species that are about to go extinct, and this has been demonstrated and tracked. So you have some quite powerful, and I would say beautiful in a moral sense, legal instruments like the Endangered Species Act. These should be our highest law. We should, if we keep creatures from going extinct and decarbonize and do all the other necessary things for our own health, that will be also the biosphere's health, then the next generations will be able to improve on what we've done and keep the process going. But if we allow a mass extinction event to happen, that's not recoverable from. If there are human generations in the far future, they will be without these creatures who have gone extinct. And this is just beyond the pale of what we should try for. So we have a kind of a North Star morally that everybody should be on board with. And it's partly for human health. It's partly just the right thing to do for our biosphere, which is our extended body. So I'm finding this 30 by 30 movement, because it's lawful, because it's has to do with property rights and how to treat the land, and a stupendously encouraging development that if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, no way, we're not that together. And now here we are doing it. So there might be signs in that for other improvements as well.
As I mentioned earlier at UCS, a big piece of what we do is we take our technical research and analysis and translate it for different audiences, the public, media, and policymakers. Each of you also transform science into narrative through your own lens and lived experiences. How have you approached this work, determining how science shows up and informs your writing? Jessica, do you want to speak to indigenous science as well as sort of traditional Western science?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why, I went under Penguin Random House to write my first book was because, and North Atlantic books, is because oftentimes, we are told as scientists to write in academic presses where, we are just talking to an echo chamber, where we're just talking to people who understand the terminology, the jargon that we are taught as scientists. And I think that for me, especially understanding that I wanted to uplift indigenous voices, those of us, in my community who don't have the credentials, who don't have that use of terminology, to kind of share their testimonies, especially their lived experiences as they're seeing climate change impacts in their local environments. I went for a trade press, and I think that as a result of that, right, I was able to write to community members as opposed to just talking to scientists. And even when I used terminology, I was able to break it down and kind of explain it. And one of the kind of metrics that I use and especially implement in my work is something that my father taught me, right? That if I cannot necessarily explain what I'm doing in the scientific realm to my community members, I'm not necessarily holding on to my responsibilities as an Indigenous woman and member of those communities. And I think that as a result of that, that's something that I carry in my heart, where I communicate the science and I can sit in a panel of scientists and discuss these topics. But when it goes back to working with my communities, I'm able to share that terminology in ways that they can understand it, and not to kind of see them as, inferior to me, just because, oftentimes we have to acknowledge the science policy is, filled with so much terminology that oftentimes that terminology is not accessible to the people who are experiencing the impacts of climate change, who are living every day those impacts, and who are being forced to leave their lands, where their identities are being uplifted, where their identities, especially their indigeneity, has been, created, especially in partnership and kinships with our environments. And I think that that's something that I carry even moving forward as an Indigenous woman and an Indigenous scientist.
Chantal? In terms of how, science informs your work?
Yeah, it was a
we have a lot
process.
of scientists on the call listening.
Yeah, it was a process for me to figure out how much science belongs in a work of art before it becomes too weighted, because before it becomes a little bit like a lesson instead of a work of art. But I do like the inspiration and getting inspiration from science, because there's so much happening. And so much that I think if we're not in the science world, we don't necessarily hear about, or we don't take time to take in and see what it really means. There was a quantum physicist that I read years ago, I forgot his name, but for him, science was the closest way to get to God, because he approached the mystery of creation. And I do find that there is, in science, there is so much that is, that provokes awe and admiration, and a sense of how small we are in this huge universe, and being able to capture that, I think, to me was really crucial in expanding what theater can do, because we come from, I think in the US, we come from several years of theater being focused on the family and on the individual. And I wanted, and on, you know, going to a theater and seeing an apartment recreated on stage. And I was very interested in seeing how we can go bigger than that, and we can deal with bigger issues, and science was a way to do that.
Mhm. You know, it's the same for me in the sense that literary fiction was like the apartment on a stage. The relationships between a couple individuals and their domestic problems with each other, and it's so tightly constrained. And there's a bigger world out there that these art forms need to be able to capture somehow. And the novel can do that by stretching itself out in time, by going into the future also, and by paying attention to other creatures than the human, and then also by focusing on scientists. This is what I've done my whole career. There are new stories, there are interesting characters, quite hilarious characters in the attempt to be rational when you're also very emotional. Another false distinction that even the sciences have become completely aware of, the element of emotion and cognition and executive function, etc. But what I want to say is that the scientific community is already a utopian politics in action. And so there's a lot of people that are impatient with politics as being a world of lies and compromises and attempts to convince people of things that aren't true, etc. And you can get away from that by being a scientist and study something solidly, get evidence, convince other people by evidence-based reason. And everybody else has agreed to play that game, and they look at things reasonably, look at the evidence, and they either agree or they don't in a discourse that is the scientific method. Underneath that is an ethic of a shared respect for each other, of respect for reality, of the greatest good for the greatest number, or some kind of underlying value system that is underneath it. So for decades now, I've been trying to portray science as an ongoing and self-improving, because it has some horrific mistakes in its past. Being a human enterprise, it's not magical, and it never has been. And when it was introduced, it did not solve all problems, but in fact, it created many new problems that we never had before by way of its failures and by way of its successes. So you have a rather marvelous opportunity there as a storyteller to describe this, because a lot of scientists are deep into their discipline. They kind of have to be to provide anything new. And they're also very often generalists. I wouldn't want to do any stereotyping here, but I do think that this sort of shudder of horror at the idea of politics and that science is a refuge from it. Scientists learn in their lab politics and their department politics, in the fight over money and resources and credit, that it's as political as can be, because it's a human enterprise. Well, but it's also, if you're a utopian science fiction writer, as I am, it's the, how can I say it? It's the strongest politics. It's the clearest, best politics. People are drawn to it for its clarity and power. And then the fact that it can do good things in the world is the ultimate goal behind that. So I'm thinking that it's an under-theorized political project, the sciences. And so that's what I try to write about.
I hate to say, but we actually are getting close to the end of our program. So I'd like to ask one more question of all the panelists, which is simply, what do you hope that people take away from your work? What's your greatest hope that they're taking away from what you've produced? Chantal, would you like to start?
Yeah, I hope people leave with a sense of awe. I hope they leave with curiosity and a desire to learn more. And I hope they leave with courage to want to be engaged and try to make things better.
Jessica?
Yeah, I hope that people, gain hope, that not everything is despair. And I also want people to take action and actually learn about the local indigenous communities in the areas that they're, settled or occupying. Because, in the chat, I saw that many people were saying, oh, I'm from Boston, California, but not many people acknowledge the indigenous peoples whose lands they're currently living on. Because oftentimes when we look at taking actions, especially for solutions, many of us can actually work with the local indigenous communities to make those solutions, to make, to take action, so that we don't feel like it's just talking to, the choir or preaching to the choir, because we can actually do local things where oftentimes, in the sciences, especially in climate change, we talk about the global perspective, but we forget the local perspective. And I think that that's something that I hope that people gain that momentum, right? I feel empowered to learn more about the local indigenous communities on the lands that they're currently occupying and settled in.
Thank you. And Stan.
Well, I guess what I would like people to understand, since so many of my stories have been set in imaginary futures, is that there are going to be people as real as us in the time to come, which could stretch out for literally thousands of years. And those people deserve to come to life in a healthy world. So since we could do better and make a better world, we should. So this is what I would like people to take out of my fiction.
Stan, Jessica, and Chantal, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fabulous conversation. Really, really appreciate you taking your time. I would encourage all of our listeners and viewers to check out their work. And also keep an eye out for other ways that narrative and science intersect in the world around us. We welcome your engagement in other aspects of UCS's work. You can learn more at our website at ucsusa.org, or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And thank everybody for your time, and have a wonderful evening.